Greetings, Ohio Valley. This is Dan Lima with OSU Extension from Belmont County.
And this is Karen Cox from WVU Extension in Ohio County. Thanks for tuning in to Extension Calling, your source for research-based information for the farm, garden, and home.
Hello, Karen.
Good morning.
Another warm February week, huh?
Right? This weather's insane, man.
Yeah. And again, the only thing that we always say is, whatever it is, like the ups and downs or just the warmth, or really hasn't been just cold, because even when we got super cold, it got super hot, like not too long after that. But messy is always the word that describes 2023 winter.
So far, yeah. But we're here, and one of the worries I have when we talk about these weird winters is, of course, the fruit trees, right? And the trees getting confused, sprouting their buds too early, and then, of course, we know we're getting another cold snap, and so it's just real frustrating for me to just keep watching our fruit crops go.
Well, I mean, I'm confused as much as the fruit trees are,
That's true.
But I guess they really respond to the environment. So, and then once they commit. It's just like the cycles that they go through.
Yeah, and you think about the climate that we're in, right? So if we go back historically and we look at this region, it was mostly forested. So, in the 1900s, they came through and they pretty much clear cut all of West Virginia in southwestern Ohio. And so a lot of the trees that you see now are all regrowth from that clear cutting and then the continual harvesting that occurred after that. But what I'm trying to get to with this is, as this region develops, the Appalachian mountain chain is a very, very old mountain chain. And so the soils on it have been there for a long time, decaying, building organic matter. And the flora, or the plant life that has developed on those soils, has been in response to the significant amount of rainfall that this region receives. And so when you look at the ability of a tree to absorb rainfall, it was a nice balanced system. And now, as we have built up our communities and expanded our cities and highways and roadways, we've put all of this impermeable pavement down and impermeable surfaces. So when rainfall hits them, it doesn't get absorbed by them, or, as with a tree, pulled up back out of the soil and pushed up back into the atmosphere. So we've kind of cut off that water cycling system that helps to keep our lower areas from experiencing significant water collection, also known as flooding. And so what my thought is that if we can encourage people to plant trees where it's appropriate to plant trees, then we can help to shift back that cycle a little bit so that it's closer to the natural ecosystem that our soil types are used to having. And so if you have the space to plant a tree and you're thinking about planting a tree, or if you are building a home site and you want to keep some trees, there's some really important things to keep in mind when you are looking at that. And like all the things that Dan and I talk about, it all starts with the soil.
That's right, it does. And speaking of construction sites, right? So we're talking about building homes. We're talking about putting down foundations. If you're building, you have to compact the ground. There's no way around it. So
this is true.
I mean, whether it's accidental or on purpose, and if you're building, you are compacting on purpose. That's going to really be prohibitive for most growth, whether we're talking a herbaceous type plants, we're talking shrubs. and trees just as much, if not more. They have larger roots, and they require a larger footprint as far as that reach of those roots. So when you're constructing a home and then you want to make a nice landscape, you want a nice yard, you want some shade trees out there, you want your favorite trees out there. What Karen said was like spot on. You have to know, how big is this tree going to get, and is this the right place for it? Is it too close to the house? And also remember that the closer to the house, especially newer construction, the more compact the soil. So I would suggest, as a way to get around that without waiting too long for the soil to uncompact, is just to bring in soil. You can always bring in, but you're going to have to bring in probably a good, 10, 20 tons and make a nice mound to put the tree on. Well, you also have to
consider, if you are doing new construction, a lot of times they scrape the topsoil off, and what you're left with is just subsoil, which is not really conducive to growing plants. So you really need to make sure that your construction company saves your topsoil for you so that you can spread it back onto the site, because bringing in topsoil can have its own issues and problems, namely knotweed. So it's really important that if you are doing new construction, to make sure you have with your contractor an agreement to save and respread the topsoil. But that's not going to solve all the problems, because, tree roots do need to have some depth to them. Now, the majority of tree roots, we're talking 80% of your tree roots, are going to be in the top 10 to 12 inches of soil, depending on your soil type and how compacted it is, right? So one of the things we recommend after a new construction project, if you are planting a tree, or if you've had a construction project near a tree, is to have a company come in and use what's called an air spade. And this is basically a knife that cuts the soil deep without using a heavy weight. So it's not like a tractor spade or a spade with a shovel, but it uses air, and it just kind of moves the soil up out of a region. Now, they can also do vertical mulching, which is where they drill a hole in the soil and then they fill it with a mulch of sorts. So something that is going to add a little bit more organic matter,
like compost,
and something that is going to add more pore space for that area.
So would compost be a good thing for that?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Compost would be great for that. Now, the problem with doing that in a yard is it will definitely help your tree, but it can make your yard look a little polka dotted. But, if you do it right, maybe you're planning for that polka dot. A little bit of extra fertilizer on the grass can actually help reduce that polka dot look. But if your tree is having problems because your soil is compacted, getting more air into that soil is really, really critical, because they need that pore space. An ideal soil for growing a tree has 50% pore space. Now, that includes your macropores and your micropores. And we're getting a little technical on here, but the macropores are basically what hold the air, and the micropores are basically where the water gets kind of locked up. So the macropores can sometimes have water in them after a big rainstorm. It's like the sponge, right? So if you have a sponge and you pour water on top of it, it gets to a point where it stops absorbing water and it starts running out of the bottom of it. That is your field capacity, right? Or no, sorry, your saturation point, right? And then after the water is drained out of that sponge without you squeezing it or anything, there's still water in that sponge. That is your field capacity, right? And so that is how much water is in your soil. Now, when you squeeze that sponge, the water that comes out at that point, the water that's available to be released, that is the available water to plants to grow. So after you've squeezed it, there's still water in that sponge. It's still wet, but that water is not available. And so you can think about that as your permanent wilting point in your soil. So there's always water in the soil, especially in our clay soils. There's always water in the soil. It's just whether or not the plants are allowed to have it, because the soil is going to keep some for itself.
Yeah. So when we're talking about the particles that make up soil, so we're talking about clay, we're talking about silt and sand. Clay is probably the type of sponge, and I'm using it as a metaphor, that can hold the most water. So clay is going to be able to retain that water longer. than something like sand or silt. And
Right. So
Eastern
it's a higher
Ohio,
quality sponge material.
yeah, it just holds more water. And it is a characteristic of clay. And hate it or love it, like in a drought, clay is good.
Mm-hmm.
When you're saturated, clay is not so good because
Mm-hmm.
it also holds that water. So what Karen was saying about squeezing that sponge and compaction, those are kind of related. With clay, it takes a lot longer for that field to be ready to be driven on, to take tractors through any kind of heavy machinery. So
Yeah, I just
it's
got
more prone to get compacted.
it
Yeah,
really is. And even like homeowners and people who live in neighborhoods, we if you want to park under a tree, and this is really a problem with construction sites because everyone wants to park under the tree, right? Because then your vehicle is nice and comfortable in the shade.
unless it's
But
spring, then it's covered in bird poop. Right?
well, there's that too. But you park under that vehicle or that vehicle under a tree, and just the weight of that vehicle sitting there is causing compaction, especially on a clay soil, especially after a rainfall. So you really want to wait at a minimum of 3 days if you have to absolutely drive under a tree before you're driving on wet soil, because you can like squish out 50% of your pore space in one pass if the soil is wet in a clay soil. And losing that pore space is going to take you years to get that back, because the way you get it back naturally is you have to have all those little worms and microorganisms wiggling around and eating organic material and pooping and eating each other. And that's what creates pore space, right? And the more you compact it, the more those little guys have to work to fix the problem you created. So that's why in urban environments and suburban environments, we recommend these other tools, these mechanical means to help improve the ability of those microorganisms, which is why that vertical mulching is so nice, because it gives them food, right? Basically, you're feeding them a little bit of extra so that they can keep moving and get that pore space open back up for you.
Yeah, and like what I was talking about with bringing in more soil, I know there's like there are invasives out there, and you could bring in something that you really don't want. But along with that, what I was thinking is kind of in the concept that you're talking about. So when you make a nice gradual mound, I'm not saying like a huge mountain, but just like a mound, and I'm not saying build up dirt around a tree, because
No.
that's a terrible thing to do. But before you plant, if you did have a nice gradual mound, just like a raised bed, you think about drainage in a raised bed, right? We do that because it tends to drain a little bit more because you're kind of above the water table, and you get better drainage. I mean, that is something to consider if possible. It's not always possible. Sometimes you have soil and you don't know what to do with it, but that's a rarity.
That's
And
a rare
sometimes
thing.
and sometimes you have to pay a lot of money to bring in soil. But we're talking about compacting the soil around a tree. We're talking about drainage, having that nice little mound, especially, I guess. See, they did that in my place, and it's kind of compacted ground. It was strip mined, and
That's a special situation there.
it's one of the better drainage areas,
Yeah.
and they put a high value tree there. So there's things you can do to kind of take a little bit more care of a high value tree. And I'm not saying it's going to work great, or it's another layer of protection because you have less standing water.
Right. Well, it's helpful for grading too, to make sure that you're getting the right slope, especially around your house. You want that 20% grade right around your house so that you can get the water to go away from your basement.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, definitely there are really important reasons to bring in soil on a construction site. But one of the things some people do is when they're having a home built and they bought a wooded lot, and wooded lots sell really well because people like trees, right? There's a natural connection between us and our trees. And in some of us, it's stronger.
Imagine that.
but if you want to save the trees on your wooded lot, there are a lot of things you have to consider. Like, first of all, if your trees are all little stick things, little tiny things that have been used to be growing in the understory, they don't have a lot of tensile strength to them because they've never been exposed to the wind. And so if you have a tree that's 12 inches in diameter and doesn't have a lot of taper on the bottom, when a big windstorm comes through, the crown on these trees is way up high. They haven't built those lower layers to help deflect that wind speed, and they can be more prone to wind throw. Some species are even more prone to getting sunburned. We call it sun scald on trees. Like white oak is really bad for getting sun scald when you open it up. So you do have to take into consideration the size of the trees, the age of the trees, and whether or not they're going to be able to respond to that significant change in their environment. Because not only are you taking them away all their friends, but you're also adding more sunlight and you're decreasing the humidity. If you go into a forest environment, they actually monitor and maintain their own humidity levels. It's always more humid in a forest, and that's on purpose. Those trees need that extra humidity. And so you want to do whatever you can to help maintain the humidity around those trees that are being exposed to new environmental stressors. But the most important thing you can do, the absolute most critical, most important thing you can do if you want to protect and save a beautiful tree in your home construction project, you have got to fence it off. You have got to keep all of the equipment and vehicles and storage materials away from the root zone of that tree. So you really want to fence off underneath that tree a minimum of, I believe it's 1 foot per diameter of tree. And the reason you want to protect the roots is because you need to protect that pore space in the soil, because trees need oxygen. And while for the process of photosynthesis that we all learned in 4th grade, we know that we get oxygen from that as a byproduct. But trees do still need some oxygen, and they get it from the soil. The oxygen is used in
Cellular respiration.
respiration. Yes, in
Yeah,
respiration
well, cellular respiration, right?
yes, to convert those sugars back into energy so that the tree can grow, right?
Yeah, like this is such a misconception, but at a cellular level, cells are the building blocks of eukaryotic organisms. So people, plants, whatever. But like at the cell level, the way that cells make energy to basically keep us alive is the same. Like the mitochondria. Oh man, I'm really nerding out here.
The mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell.
But the plants make sugars, right? And then the sugars, we consume the sugars, and we use oxygen to help break down that stuff at a cellular level. Plants do the same, but they can make their food and eat their food. But they tend to make it faster than they eat it, so they can use other types of sugars to create biomass as well. But basically, long story short, they need oxygen too, everywhere: roots, shoot, and trunk.
Yeah, and one of the things that a lot of people don't recognize, especially for young trees, photosynthesis occurs in the trunk. So if you have a very young tree that you're just planting and you keep that wrap on it all year round, it doesn't, especially in the wintertime where it's trying to build those new roots to get itself established, that wrap can actually reduce the ability of the tree to grow new roots over the winter because it's not getting as much food, I guess.
Well, if it's green, it
That's
photosynthesizes.
right.
That's the rule of thumb. So if you got a new like the new limbs that come out,
Yep,
they're green, they're photosynthesizing.
that's right.
A green fruit is technically photosynthesizing. It has chloroplast. That they actually get converted from chloroplast to chromoplast later
Ooh.
on in development. But like, yeah, if it's green, it's photosynthesizing. And a lot of times during development, the plant needs a little more help. So if you inhibit that physiological process of allowing smaller stems to photosynthesize, it's going to be deficient in nutrients.
That's right. So you do need to the wraps that come from the nursery are there to protect the tree during transport. And yes, we all know that we're in deer country, and if you don't protect your young tree from deer, you won't have a young tree anymore. But those tight wraps that come on there, that paper wrap or the plastic ones, those can actually trap moisture up against the bark too and make them more prone to decay and disease. So you do want to take those wraps off, put a cage around your tree. It works a lot better than a wrap anyway for protecting it from deer, because sometimes deer just rip the wrap off because, they're butt hits.
Yeah, yeah, chicken wire. Chicken wire works great. And then just a few T-post, not T-posts, but like the
A few stakes, whatever you want to use. But yeah, so protect trees before you do any construction. Make sure you fenced off 1 foot for every inch of diameter for the tree you want to save. And for a young tree that you're just planting, you want to fence that off too and protect that tree, protect its root zone. And mulch is your friend. Mulch helps to improve that. Humidity around the tree. It helps to keep the roots nice and moist, but you don't want it so deep that it smothers the tree and takes away that air availability, right? So if it's deeper than 4 inches, you need to chill out and spread that mulch a little further on the ground, because that actually can suffocate the tree and the roots will start growing up into your yard. And, a lot of people complain, they'll call me like, why are my tree roots growing into my yard? Well, it's not that really that they're trying to grow into your yard. They just need oxygen. And so if you aerate your soil regularly, you'll be less likely to have those annoying surface roots. Now, some species naturally have annoying surface roots and there's nothing you can do about it. So you have to make sure when you're choosing your tree, you're choosing the tree that's going to give you the characteristics that you want. And those are some things that you want to look at by species. You want something that maybe has deeper roots, or if you like those surface roots and you're going to use them for little different ground cover pockets, you're going to put a rainbow of ground cover under it, hey, that's awesome. But sometimes if you have those surface roots, just put some ground cover under there and stop mowing your lawn.
See, Karen, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's more damaging to plant a tree too deep than a little shallow, correct?
That is exactly correct. In fact, planting too deep is one of the major causes of tree death. So yeah, definitely.
See, I was going to say, like, when I'm putting trees in, I like to take the uppermost root and just have it like on the surface. The highest root that comes out, I just kind of use that as my flag marker for the crown, for that flare, right? I know I've heard you talk enough. The bottom flare of the trunk, where you have the root and the trunk come together, the crown right there. I like to keep one surface, like just the highest root just on the surface and everything else below it.
Oh, Dan, you're making me so proud right now.
Well, that way it's like a guarantee that you're not going too deep.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah, and it's a nice thing to use. You have that uppermost root. It's because not all trees have a really significant root crown, right? They're not gonna be so obvious. So it's really good to use that uppermost root. Now, if you are buying a containerized tree, you do want to be cautious because sometimes there are epicormic roots that are growing under the soil because it got planted too deep at the nursery. And you want to check to make sure there's not like a little gap in your roots where there's nicer, more evenly formed roots down below, a couple stragglers up top. So you do want to make sure it's the first true root and not a false root.
That's a great point. I didn't even think about that. But the adventitious roots, I guess, is that another way to say it? Because I've always said adventitious roots, like basically roots that kind of grow for support, that's not a true root.
Well, okay, so there are a couple different types of roots on trees. You've got your structural support roots, which are the ones that hold the tree up, right? And then you have your feeder roots, which come off of lateral roots, which are the ones you're really talking about when you're looking at planting. So those lateral roots are the ones that are going to provide the majority of your feeder roots, and your sinker roots are going to go down and get water. But you really are looking for those first lateral roots.
So it's great, just a great marker. Just plan it right. Let's talk about the hole depth though. So you're digging the hole. You did mention to put like some compost in there.
Actually, no, I did not. I said put compost in with vertical mulching.
Vertical mulching, not around. So this is like at the drip line, not
That's just randomly around your around your yard, yeah.
okay.
So around the
Okay.
drip line, and under the tree too. But when you're planting a tree, you don't want anything in the hole that wasn't in the hole already, other than the tree. You want to use only the native soil. You don't want to add gravel. Like a lot of people will put gravel in the bottom to encourage drainage, but what that does is it actually creates a perched water table, because the clay above it doesn't want to let go of the water into those larger pores. Remember, we talked about the macro pores hold air and the micro pores hold water. So when you have a lot of small pore spaces above a lot of really big pore spaces, the water is going to hang out in the little ones above that gravel. So do not put gravel or sand in the bottom of your planting hole, because you're going to create that perched water table and actually drown your tree. So don't put anything back in the hole except what you took out of it and the tree.
Yeah, because it's not a container. It doesn't have drainage holes at the bottom, right? So
Right.
so yeah, you don't. It'll just sit there.
It'll just sit there.
Yeah.
And when you're planting in a heavier clay soil, you want to scratch up the sides of the hole to make sure that the roots have an easy way to pass through. Otherwise, you're just basically putting it in a container, because our clay can seal up around the edges, and then you could basically just put it in a container. And that causes all sorts of other problems. But to make sure we don't forget this, you dig your hole 2 to 3 times the width of the root ball, and never any deeper than the root ball. So if you want to dig a hole because you want to dig a hole, then go dig, like, a pit or a drainage ditch over there. Don't just keep digging down, down, down when you're planting a tree. You want a super shallow hole where that first root is at the soil line. And you can measure like how deep your hole is just using your shovel. Just hold it up next to your root ball, hold it in the hole, and just compare where that tree is going to be, so that you can make sure it doesn't get planted too deeply.
Yeah, and err in the conservative side of more shallow.
That's right. Yeah. Your tree will survive better if it's planted more shallowly than if it's planted too deeply, for sure, especially in our heavy soils. And then when you're done planting, you want to make sure, like the grass that's on top, if you're planting in a yard, just take that grass off and put it in your compost bin. Don't put it back in the hole. One of the things that I learned at this conference was that if you put that grass in the hole, you can actually end up with anaerobic decay, which will steal all the nitrogen from your tree. So you don't want that to happen. You want to take that grass, put it in your compost bin, and just put the soil back in the hole. If you really want to keep that grass there, you can put a berm around the edge and use it to keep your water whenever you're watering that tree inside around the root ball. So you want to tamp that soil down. You don't want to leave big air pockets, right? Because you don't want those tree roots to dry out, but you don't want to stomp it into oblivion either. So there's a delicate balance, especially when our clay gets wet. It gets super sticky. So don't overwater it before you tamp it in. Or you can go ahead and put some mulch on top and then tamp it down with your feet and just kind of push down gently. You don't want to get out there and jump up and down on it, because you'll tear some roots.
And remember that clay retains water for much longer than most soil. So, don't just go in there the next dry day.
Well, yeah, and you also need to remember, though, that when you're planting a young tree, the lack of water or too much water is probably the biggest killer. So you want to make sure that you are planning to water your tree for the next year. So you need 1 gallon per inch of DBH or per inch of diameter. And you want to make sure that you are giving that once a week. So if it rains, obviously you don't need to water, just like with your tomatoes, right? If we get an inch of rain, don't water your tree. If we don't get an inch of rain, water your tree. And you're going to do that for the entire first year. You can spread it out once it starts getting established. Maybe go to every 2 weeks, maybe go to every month, depending on how much rain we're getting. But when we get that summer slump where we don't have much rain and it's super hot, your tree is photosynthesizing faster, it's growing faster, and you need to make sure you're providing enough water to balance that work as it's building its root system and getting those feeder and sinker roots out there to find more nutrients and more water. So do plan to water your tree. Don't skimp on the water. You can use a tree bag or a tree diaper to help you, but recognize if you're putting a tree bag on and you're not filling it, you're actually making your problem worse because it will deflect all the rain off of the root ball, and you don't want that. Thanks for listening to Extension Calling. This show is a collaboration between OSU Belmont County Extension Educator Dan Lima and WVU Ohio County Extension Agent Karen Cox. If you'd like a transcript of this show, contact us at the office. Also, let us know if you enjoy the show by ranking us on your podcast app.